James Franco hadn't planned on staying long in the creaking, vine-wrapped studio tucked behind a crumbling brick wall on the outskirts of Silver Lake. The property, passed down from a distant uncle he barely remembered, had been sitting untouched for decades, abandoned since the 1970s, when the art scene here buzzed with political fire and youth rebellion. All he'd wanted was a quick cleanup, a signature, maybe even a photo op for nostalgia. But the moment he stepped inside, something shifted. Dust floated in the shafts of afternoon light like lazy snowflakes. The air carried a scent of oil paint, wood rot, and time. Canvases stood like sentinels against the far wall, some slashed, others just blank. The floor was littered with newspaper clippings, yellowed and brittle, headlines screaming of protests, police raids, and an artist's name he'd never heard, Renzo Elias. James moved slowly, letting the silence settle around him. The energy of the place was heavy, not haunted exactly, but charged, like something had been left unfinished. That's when he saw the frame. It leaned against the back wall, partially hidden behind a splintered easel. Unlike the others, this one was empty, its canvas long removed, its edges scorched as though it had narrowly escaped fire. A note, faded and fragile, was taped to the bottom of the frame with old masking tape. "They will not erase what they cannot understand. R.E." James ran his fingers over the wood, tracing the soot in the carved initials, R.I., burned into the bottom corner. He didn't know who Renzo Elias was, or why this frame felt so important. But something told him this was the key. To what, he wasn't sure. But it started here. That night, he sat on the studio floor surrounded by old sketchbooks and scrap paper, reading by a flashlight because the power was still out. He found sketches of riots, murals, faces twisted in anguish and defiance. He found letters, dozens of them, addressed but never sent, speaking of censorship, betrayal, and something called the vanishing. The last line in one letter struck him. If they silence the image, they silence the truth. But someone will come who sees the frame and asks what once filled it. James leaned back against the cold brick wall, the frame resting beside him. He wasn't just cleaning up an old studio anymore. He was stepping into someone else's silence, one that had waited decades to be heard. The next morning, James Franco returned to the studio armed with coffee, a notebook, and a growing sense of obligation. The night had brought dreams, fleeting images of faceless crowds, raised fists, and a man in a beret, his eyes haunted but determined. James didn't know if it was imagination or something more, but one thing was certain. The frame had awakened something buried. He began cataloging what he found. Letters, receipts, notes written on the backs of flyers from decades ago. There was a pattern forming, a timeline. Renzo Elias had been more than just an artist. He was an activist, a provocateur, and according to one tattered envelope marked "Return to Sender," a man who vanished in 1974. James drove to the local library to dig deeper, but there was little in the digital archives. Renzo's name had all but disappeared. One grainy photo from a protest march, a single article mentioning an anti-establishment muralist whose work was confiscated for inciting unrest. No birth records, no death certificate, no gallery exhibits, just gaps. He widened his search to community records, found an old news clipping buried in microfiche. Headline, "Studio Fire Mars Anti-Government Art Space. Suspected arson leaves one missing." There was a photo of the aftermath, charred wood, crumbled brick, and in the background, the frame. It hadn't been scorched in storage. It had survived a fire. James returned to the studio with renewed focus, examining the frame under sunlight. Hidden beneath layers of soot along the inside edge, he found it. Brushstrokes, faint, smudged, almost invisible. Someone had tried to erase the painting, or someone had tried to preserve it after it was ruined. The truth was unclear. Then, tucked between pages of a sketchbook, he found a cassette tape, labeled simply, "The Vanishing Final Message." James scrambled to find something that could play it, eventually dragging out an old stereo from a closet, its buttons stiff with age. The tape clicked into place. Renzo's voice was tired but calm, with a gentle rasp. "If you're listening to this," then the silence didn't last. "That means you found the frame. You see, they didn't just burn my studio. They erased my art from galleries, censored my name from press, buried my story under a bureaucracy. I painted truth, ugly, beautiful, dangerous truth, and they couldn't afford to let it breathe." There was a pause. "But I made one final piece. My soul is in it. I left instructions for someone I trusted, a woman named Lila Marquez. If she's still alive, she has the last reel of this story. Tell her the frame still stands." The tape ended abruptly. James sat in silence. His fingers trembled as he scribbled the name down. Lila Marquez. Somewhere out there was a woman who had protected the last known painting of Renzo Elias, and maybe the answer to why the world had tried so hard to forget him. He spent days following leads, calling art collectives, scanning forums, emailing obscure gallery curators. Most didn't respond. A few recognized the name Renzo with a strange mix of reverence and fear. But one reply stood out. Subject: Re-inquiry. Lila Marquez. Message: if you're serious, meet me in Echo Park. Bring the frame. I'll know if it's real. Signed, LM. James's pulse quickened. This wasn't just discovery, it was resurrection. As he carefully wrapped the frame in cloth and loaded it into his car, he paused to glance once more around the studio, the cracked tiles, the dusty windows, the scent of ash and turpentine that lingered in the air. Renzo hadn't vanished. He'd been waiting to be found. The early morning fog in Echo Park curled low around the streets as James Franco stepped out of his car, the blank frame carefully wrapped in a painter's cloth and tucked under his arm. The park, still half asleep, whispered with the sound of rustling leaves and the slow rhythm of distant joggers. Birds cut through the pale sky, and somewhere in the distance, a saxophone played a lonesome tune from a second-story window. James checked the message again. By the boathouse, 8 o'clock a.m. He followed the paved path toward the water, heart heavy with anticipation. Each step felt like peeling back a layer of history. When he reached the boathouse, a woman stood there, weathered but graceful. Her silver hair pulled into a long braid, her eyes sharp with memory. She was wearing a worn denim jacket with paint stains on the sleeves. Lila Marquez? James asked. She turned slowly, taking in his face, then the cloth bundle in his arms. You look like him, she said. Renzo? No, she replied, like someone who still believes that truth is worth the mess it makes. James unwrapped the frame, revealing its aged wood, the faint remnants of paint clinging like ghosts to its edges. Lila reached out, brushing the corners, her eyes welled. I watched him paint this, she whispered. He finished it 2 days before the fire, called it The Witness, said if the world ever went deaf to suffering, this painting would scream for him. What happened to it? James asked. Lila sat on a nearby bench, patting the space beside her. The night of the fire, I knew it was coming. The protests had gotten violent. The city cracked down on dissenters. Renzo was on a list, he told me. Said they'd rather erase art than let it provoke. She looked out across the water. So I swapped the real painting with a decoy, hid the original. Then I left. I've been waiting all this time for someone to come looking for it. Someone who understood that silence can be louder than any protest. James leaned forward. Where is it now? She studied him. Are you ready for what it shows? I think I have to be. Lila pulled out a small key from a chain around her neck and handed it to him. There's an abandoned gallery off La Brea. Renzo called it the Hollow. He used to say real art didn't belong in places with wine and whispers. It's all boarded up now, but in the cellar, behind a false wall, you'll find it. 2 hours later, James was standing before a rusted metal door marked only by a sun-faded symbol. Renzo's signature etched into the frame with a pocket knife, a broken eye surrounded by fire. He pushed inside. Dust choked the air. Broken mannequins leaned against moldy canvases. A staircase led down into darkness. James descended, flashlight in hand, heart pounding. The cellar smelled of mildew and history. He found the wall exactly as Lila described, a patchwork of drywall with a seam that didn't match. He pried it open. Inside, covered in a thick tarp, was the painting. He carefully unrolled it and gasped. The witness was enormous, chaotic, breathtaking. The painting was a sprawling mural of faceless crowds watching a child standing on a podium, arms outstretched, surrounded by smoke and riot gear. Words had been painted and then slashed through, layers upon layers of slogans, poems, headlines, each one burning through to the next. In the child's chest was a mirror fragment embedded in the canvas, reflecting whoever stood before it. But what shook James most was the corner. Renzo had painted a man crouched with a camera. The face looked unmistakably like James himself, as if Renzo had seen him coming. He stood frozen. Then slowly James whispered, this was never about protest alone. It was about legacy. He photographed every inch. He contacted curators, historians, galleries that had once turned Renzo away. He told Lila's story, played the tape on interviews, showed the painting during a pop-up exhibit titled The Frame Remembers. And the world listened. Within months, Renzo Elias was no longer a forgotten ghost. His work was displayed beside the giants of resistance art. Universities taught his story. Activist collectives adopted his imagery. And that blank frame, the one that had started it all, was mounted beside the mural as a symbol of absence restored. James returned to the studio one final time. He stood in the center of the room, light pouring in through the cracked glass, the smell of paint faint in the air. On the dusty floor, he placed a small plaque. To Renzo Elias, who painted the truth and let time finish the masterpiece. He smiled. Somewhere, he believed, Renzo was finally at peace. If this story moved you, don't let it fade like forgotten art. Like the video to honor Renzo's legacy. Comment with your thoughts or your favorite hidden art stories. Subscribe for more cinematic tales that uncover the unheard and the unseen. And remember, every frame has a story. Some just take longer to find.